Welcome, everyone. My name is Besner. I work with the People Affected by Diabetes Knowledge and Connection team at Diabetes Canada, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining today's event from Ottawa, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. As a health-focused organization, Diabetes Canada recognizes that there is systemic racism within and throughout our institutions, and that we have the responsibility and power to create culturally safe and appropriate environments of care. From wherever you are tuning in, I invite you to take a moment to reflect on the land on which we live, recognize the harms and mistakes of the past, and consider how we can all contribute in a meaningful way to reconciliation and collaboration. We are here to kick off a new live webinar series at Diabetes Canada called Diabetes Open Hours. Thank you so much for being part of this event. Diabetes Open Hours is all about you, the person who is affected by diabetes. If you have been diagnosed or are caring for someone with diabetes, you're not alone. Millions of Canadians are living this reality. But diabetes is complex, and different people experience it differently. Whether diabetes is new to you or you've been living with it for a long time, you've inevitably got questions. Questions about risk factors, complications, management options. Questions like, why me? Diabetes Open Hours is a live, virtual, agenda-free hour that allows participants to interact with a featured guest and a community of individuals with lived and professional diabetes experience. This is your time to ask questions, tell your story, and share with others in a safe, non-judgmental space. Diabetes Open Hours will take place toward the end of the month every second month. Each one will have a different guest that will be welcoming and a different broad theme. Diabetes Open Hours is being recorded and will be archived on the Diabetes Canada website, as well as on our YouTube channel for on-demand viewing. Today's theme is nutrition, and we are so pleased to have with us Jenna Walsh, registered dietitian and certified diabetes educator. Jenna Walsh completed her degree in human nutrition at the University of Guelph, followed by a dietetic internship through the Ottawa Hospital. She has been working as a clinical dietitian in Renfrew County since 2010, dividing her time between long-term care, inpatient and outpatient support, private practice, as well as community nutrition, which includes developing and coordinating an initiative called Kids in the Kitchen, and more recently, a virtual eating disorders support program. She added certified diabetes educator to her resume in 2017 and continues to support those living with diabetes in her community by normalizing food and movement as part of their diabetes management. She loves spending time outdoors with her spouse and 3 daughters and in the kitchen whipping up new recipes. Welcome, Jenna. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Anne. I'm very much looking forward to chatting with everyone today. So thank you.
Okay, here's how things are going to go over the next hour. Participants who are joining us for today's event can use the chat feature to submit their diabetes-related questions to Jenna. We know that nutrition is a really interesting subject. It's a huge topic and one that can be a source of confusion for many because it's very dynamic and evolving. Sometimes it's hard to separate nutrition fact from fiction and challenging to identify reliable sources of info about nutrition. But not to worry, Jenna is here to help us wade through it all. As a certified diabetes educator, she has a wealth of knowledge when it comes to all things diabetes. And as a registered dietitian, of course, her area of specialty is nutrition. So we're in really good hands today with Jenna. Using that chat feature, please, starting now and throughout the next hour, type in your diabetes nutrition questions for Jenna. So you can simply click on the chat icon that's near the bottom of your screen to open the chat. You can post your question by typing it into the text box, with the recipient being everyone, and that way everybody will be able to see your question. We also encourage people to share their diabetes stories in the chat. We welcome supportive, positive comments and emojis from the audience, so feel free to be actively part of the conversation through the chat. As the moderator, I'll relay the questions, comments, and stories to the group, and we'll do our best to get through as many as we can in the time that we have together. A few quick ground rules regarding the chat. We just ask that any comments or reactions that you share be affirming and positive, and that you use this time and the chat feature as an opportunity to further your learning, engagement, and curiosity, and support the same for others. Following this webinar, we'll be sending out an evaluation to hear what you thought about open hours and how we can better tailor it to suit your needs. So with all of that, Jenna, are you ready to begin?
Good to go.
Great. Let's get started. So while we are waiting for some questions to come in, maybe we can just start by sort of setting the stage. Jenna, can you talk to us really briefly about what the connection is between nutrition and diabetes? And what role does healthy eating play in diabetes management?
So I think I would start, I mean, I think I'm a little bit biased in terms of the role I feel that nutrition plays. At the same time, I really try to approach diabetes management with patients and clients as part of management. We all come from very different socioeconomic backgrounds. We all grew up with a different relationship with food. Some of our parents may have loved being in the kitchen. They may have included us in the kitchen. Other people may have grown up not having a clue how to cook. We all have different food budgets, cultural preferences. And so nutrition's a very individualized part of management. I think it needs to be and it should be, but it can absolutely make a drastic role and impact on our diabetes management. So even in terms of guidelines, we see at least a 1 to 2% A1C reduction potential with nutrition. I would say absolutely. I've seen much higher than that with patients, depending where A1C is starting and what level of change they end up making. So nutrition's a pretty big one. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's very true, Jenna. Now we have people joining us who are impacted by diabetes in lots of different ways, may have newly been diagnosed or have been living with diabetes for quite some time. Maybe we can just kind of go back to basics. And this is useful for anybody who is living with diabetes. Can you take a second to just talk to us a little bit about carbohydrates? So what are carbohydrates and what impact do they have generally on blood sugar?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you bring that up, because more often than not, when I'm speaking to people, I'd say at least half will pause me and say, which foods are carbohydrates? So there's a few different categories that we start to talk about when we talk about carbohydrates, but essentially think of them as like a chain. I like people to think of food kind of like Lego blocks. That makes sense for people. And then once we eat carbohydrates, they essentially are broken down to simple sugars in our body. So even if something is sugar-free, they can still have carbohydrates, meaning they will still impact your blood sugar once we ingest them. So the big one that most people know about are starch-based foods. So any grain-based, think your wheat, your oats, your barley, all of those grains are carbohydrates, and any of the foods that they end up making. We also then have our starchy veggies. That's where potatoes fall into as well. And then our fruit, they all naturally, that's where we get their delicious sweetness from, is from sugars, right? It's natural. And dairy as well. So oftentimes people forget that dairy, especially milk, has lactose, and lactose is simply a sugar or a carbohydrate. So I like people to think not so much as like, does it have sugar, but thinking in terms of carbohydrates, and that makes label reading a lot easier as well. Now, with respect to diabetes though, and blood sugar management, just because carbohydrates affect our blood sugar, it doesn't mean we can't eat them. The most important piece I ask people to pay attention to is how much can each person's own body handle or tolerate at a meal or an eating period, and blood sugars stay within target range. So that's again where our nutrition becomes very individualized, because what carbohydrates do you like eating, right? Which ones still give you enjoyment with your meals and allow you to continue to eat that way? How much of it do you need to feel satisfied from that meal? And then on top of that, does it keep your blood sugars within a safe range?
That's really helpful, Jenna. Just a reminder to everybody that if you have questions, please go to that chat feature and put them right in. We're happy to answer any questions you have related to diabetes nutrition. If you're more comfortable coming off mute, you can certainly pose your question as well out loud. I see here from a comment in the chat that Kathy is having a bit of difficulty understanding with an echo. So we'll work on that. Kathy, apologies for that. But you can come off mute, anybody, if you'd like to ask a question, or feel free to put that in the chat. And while we're waiting for some more of those questions to come in, Jenna, wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some different foods and their effects on blood sugar. So what about vegetables? You mentioned that potatoes are a starchy vegetable, but what about other veggies? What impact do those have on blood sugar?
Yeah, so we try to divide foods up into sort of those starchy and then non-starchy, right? So non-starchy typically being things like your dark leafy greens, things like zucchini and cucumbers and celery, whereas some other ones that might have more sugar in them may have a bigger impact. Unless people are on multiple daily injections of insulin, I try not to get them too focused on the exact number of carbohydrates in foods versus focusing on eating more vegetables in general, checking blood sugars 2 hours after, and just seeing how that meal has affected them. Because the one really neat thing that some studies have shown us is within each person, right? So the individual person, not larger populations, we will see repetitive similar responses to food. So one person might see their blood sugars go through the roof after having, some bran flakes and a banana. And it might be, whatever, maybe they've had 45 grams worth of carbohydrates at that meal. The person next to them might not. It might be pretty modest. We can expect for that person where that blood sugar has spiked with that specific food, we can expect that to repeat. So it's simple enough, It's still a lot of tedious work and learning, but we can start to learn our own patterns and which foods our body does well with versus what foods our body struggles a little bit more with. So absolutely, some of those squashes, the sweet potatoes, the ones that really, when we think about it, have a little bit more of that sweeter taste, tend to have more complex carbohydrates and some sugars in them, and they may affect your blood sugars more. There's a more complex part to that in terms of what we know to be the glycemic index, in terms of how much a particular food will spike a blood sugar. So that part's important as well.
All really important points. And we can see some questions now coming in through the chat, which is terrific. Keep those coming, everybody. So Kathy asked a really excellent question here. Thanks, Kathy. How do carbs impact type 1 diabetes versus type 2 diabetes versus pre-diabetes? So maybe you can kind of unpack that a little bit for us.
Mm-hmm. Great question. So I want you to think about type 1 diabetes. So let's back up a little bit. With diabetes, when we eat those carbohydrates, our body breaks them down into those very simple carbohydrates and then asks the pancreas for insulin. So the pancreas is that organ that we have, and in those beta cells that we have in the pancreas, it secretes insulin. Insulin is just a hormone. Its job is to hook onto that sugar, bring it to our muscle and brain cells, and convince them to open up and let that sugar in. Now, sometimes with diabetes, the insulin comes, takes it, cells don't open up. That's more insulin resistance. With other people, it may be more genetic in terms of type 1 diabetes. Sometimes it's a viral infection or something that damages those beta cells, and they no longer are making insulin. People with type 1 diabetes are not making any insulin. Okay, so we pay a little bit more attention to, specifically how many grams of carbohydrates we're getting in a meal, because we have to then give ourselves the exact amount of insulin to keep blood sugars in range. With type 2 diabetes, we have a little bit more flexibility sometimes because we still have some insulin being made. So the body is still taking care of some of that naturally, right? So we have a little bit of wiggle room to say. It also depends too, if we're on any other medications. So with type 2 diabetes, we would also potentially be on some oral medications or pills that address different parts of blood sugar management. So they may work at the cell level to reduce that insulin resistance we talked about, convince those cells to open up and let the sugar in. Some medications work at the liver. So while we're not eating, the liver also slowly releases sugar back into our bloodstream so that the levels are consistent. Some medications work at the kidneys. So the kidneys also filter out sugar and also keep some in our blood. So some medications try to convince the kidneys to pee more sugar out. So those carbohydrates are important in all three stages. So prediabetes, type 2, and type 1. We're a little bit more specific with the amounts with type 1 because we're giving insulin for every gram of carbohydrate, essentially. Type 2, if we're on insulin, so sometimes we're still on insulin, we are, again, being a little bit more specific. We're paying attention to, if I have 45 grams of carbohydrates, how much extra insulin do I need? Right? So we're still paying attention. We may not be as specific with those starchy versus non-starchy veggies because you start to learn yourself how your body does. With prediabetes, think of prediabetes kind of as that yellow warning flag that things are starting to go awry. We need to be more specific and pay a little bit more attention to how our body's doing with meals. Now, guidelines still don't really suggest that we have to be testing our blood sugars in the prediabetes stage. I am a very vocal advocate for testing our blood sugars at this stage because of what we just talked about. You can eat your normal meals and check your blood sugars 2 hours after to see how your body is coping with what you're eating. And I find even with people, if we can get a continuous or flash glucose monitor on in the prediabetes stage for that 2 weeks, we see such better outcomes because they can make small tweaks without being overly restrictive, and they can maintain those changes for a long time. And so little things, Kathy, like for example, I often hear people when they're diagnosed with prediabetes being terrified of things even like carrots. Whereas I would rather you eat carrots because they're nutritious and they're so valuable with lots of nutrition. And let's just check and see how your body does. And what are you eating with the carrots in terms of protein and other nutrients to see how that impacts it. I hope that answered your question.
Okay. That's a really good point, Jenna. Certainly when we're eating, we're not just consuming carbohydrates, right? So what else would make up our plate in terms of foods or nutrients, and what kind of an impact would those things have on blood sugar? And then how can we kind of incorporate all things to eat in a really well-balanced way, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, I try to focus more on a plate method, right? Where we're really trying to get back to basics around eating enough food first. I really don't find that anyone does well when we try to impose restriction and taking things away, as opposed to first focusing on, are you eating enough vegetables at every meal because they're high in fiber and they're typically low in carbohydrates? Are you eating enough protein, to maintain muscle mass? Fantastic in terms of just energy and also satiety, keeping us full longer. And then those carbohydrates, which also give us all the vitamins and minerals and fiber. Having all of those together, again, if I go back to that Lego analogy for people, it's like having a really intricate Lego block that your body has to work really hard to pull all of those pieces apart. It takes longer for the body to access those carbohydrates. And so we don't see this massive spike of blood sugars, but hopefully more of a little rolling hill. And so for a lot of patients, where we start is, okay, what are you currently doing? When are you eating? What are you eating? How much are you eating? And is there room to add? So for, typically having, say, toast and jam and a coffee for breakfast, great. But we're just having carbohydrates and carbohydrates. Can we add some veggies? Can we add some protein? It might be adding some peanut butter and sliced tomatoes on the side or something, right? A veggie omelet and one piece of toast. Try a whole bunch of different varieties, to see how their individual body tolerates.
I think that's really helpful. We've got another question coming in here from Jennifer. Jennifer works at Diabetes Canada and has lived with type 1 diabetes for a long time, and also happens to be a dietitian, so very knowledgeable when it comes to food and nutrition. But she says, in spite of all of this, eating out for her can be an ongoing challenge. So, what's your advice on eating out for people who are living with diabetes? Perhaps for people with type 1, but also for people with type 2. And how would you go about sort of estimating carb amounts of things like sauces, which may be a little bit trickier to figure out, and then working to kind of maintain those blood sugar targets?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, eating out in general can be a challenge for anyone living with diabetes in terms of knowing how much and also how it then impacts their blood sugars, right? So especially for type 1, whether they're MDI or whether they're pumping, there's a few things I'm a big fan of. First of all, is be part of a group. So any sort of diabetes online support groups, Facebook has a ton of them, but there's more outside of Facebook. I really truly find that people living the experience have more inside scoop and knowledge of the best places to eat, where they're serving consistent amounts, right? So most of the food chains that we frequent have their nutrition information available, but the sauces and all the little pieces really come down to, are they following the amounts that standard recipe suggests that they're putting on when it comes to sauces, right? Versus are they just doing a big old squirt? Easy enough, we can ask for those things on the side. That's always the safest. It's sometimes annoying for sure, but safest in terms of if we're dosing specific amounts or bolusing. The second piece too is what you may do, especially if you're eating out often, is you may have some of your own staple foods for a meal and just be getting a portion that's takeout. So I've had some patients have success with that, especially if they're on the road a lot. Say you're a busy, parent with sports and you're on the road a lot, or with work, if you're traveling with work, having some of those staples where you're boosting fiber, you're boosting protein, that can be easy as well to know the specific amounts that you're getting, or vice versa. You're bringing your carbohydrate amounts and what you're ordering might be like, a salad with chicken to get extra.
That's a super question from Jennifer. Thanks so much. And just as a reminder to everybody, keep those questions coming. Recall that open hours is all about you. So ask anything that's on your mind about diabetes and nutrition. Feel free to use the chat feature, or you can come off mute and ask your question in person. Jenna, we've heard a lot about low carb diets. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that. What is your perspective on low carb diets? Are they a fad? Are they helpful for people with diabetes? Give us the lowdown.
Yes, so this is still a really big topic and still a very controversial one, and controversial even I find in terms of my own head, because it's only effective if it's effective and realistic for the patient long term. And so when we look at eating patterns for people, whether it's ketogenic, meaning less than 5% of the diet is carbohydrates, versus low carb, which is typically under 20% of total calories coming from carbohydrates, it's effective. We can eat well, nutritionally balanced. If it fits their budget, they enjoy the foods they're eating enough nutrition, and they're still managing their diabetes well, right? So we can still be eating that 20%, have very low carb and a higher carb meal without any medications, and blood sugar still, increase after that one meal. So there's still some education, there's still some learning, there's still self-monitoring of blood glucose, even in those contexts. Is it necessary? I would say no. We can still manage our diabetes very well with a, standard Mediterranean style of eating or more flexible carbohydrates, which I find for most people. Again, I work a lot with eating disorders, so I'm very sensitive to restriction and what long-term impacts that can have. If we can make sure that carbohydrates don't feel like a bad food for patients, I'm all for that. So yes, it can be effective for patients if they're interested in addressing or trying a lower carbohydrate diet. I definitely suggest that they chat with an RD or with someone who has experience, just to make sure they're getting enough food, they're never feeling restricted, and they're still managing well.
So in your experience, what are some of the risks of somebody following a low carbohydrate diet, particularly if somebody maybe isn't doing it alongside a registered dietitian or hasn't consulted with a healthcare provider about that? So if someone's living with diabetes, are there risks?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest thing that we really want to look at, right, is the reason that they're choosing, right? So it might naturally already be the way that they prefer to eat. One of the key things that we really want to look at is, what medications are they on? Some of them are not safe to continue taking. And so we really want to look at, where is insulin at, the SGLT2s, some of the sulfonylureas. Certain medications we really should look at stopping. So that's one thing that we definitely want to start with. If there's any history of eating disorders or disordered eating, it's a big red flag for me. And it's something I really dig deeply in with people. Risk factors too is really a cost, right? If they have a fairly low budget for food, high veggies and high protein is really expensive. So my concern is actually more in terms of how are they managing to eat enough nutrition following a low carb diet. That's a big one that I think is overlooked way too often. Outside of that, those are the biggest factors. So the medications, the disordered eating, and then is it reasonable for that patient?
I think it's helpful to think about the benefits and the risks in making decisions about eating patterns. So speaking of eating patterns, you mentioned the Mediterranean diet. So just wondering if you can describe what that eating pattern is like for people who aren't familiar with the Mediterranean diet.
Yeah, so I think it's great to think of it more as a lifestyle. That's really the way that we know there's more benefit. We're focusing on lots of plant foods, lots of plant-based fats and proteins, nuts and seeds, olive oils, avocados, less red meat. So it's not gone, but it's definitely less frequent, like a few times a month as opposed to a few times a week. More fatty fish like trout and tuna, sardines, etc. The lifestyle factor too comes in terms of focusing on taking time to eat, right? We're not scarfing food down in 5 minutes and going on about our day. It's making time to cook, trying to cook more meals at home, trying to sit socially together to eat. We actually see much better outcomes and much more satisfaction from food when we're able to do that. Digestively too, we tend to actually have better digestive health when we actually sit, kind of that 30-45 minutes that we would all ideally have for 3 meals a day is important as well. So it's not so much a diet in today's sense of the word, but a way of eating.
Now, you mentioned with the Mediterranean way of eating that it heavily features vegetables. I think one thing that a lot of people are wondering about when they're diagnosed with diabetes or they've been living with it for a while is there any benefit to adopting a vegetarian diet? So cutting out animal products altogether, and whether it's a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet or any sort of variation. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Is it necessary to be vegetarian when you have diabetes?
Yeah, so definitely not necessary. The interesting thing with the evidence that we have with vegetarian lifestyles is that we also see a fairly significant reduction in heart disease for those who do follow more of a plant-based diet. So less elevated cholesterol, less elevated blood pressure, which we know risk factors for both, right? When we have diabetes and heart disease is high. So we see improvements there. We also, because I get a lot of questions when people are asking to eat more plant-based, and we're encouraging them to eat more pulses, which is, they're high fiber beans and legumes and higher in carbohydrates. And there's that moment of confusion of, but I thought I had to watch my carbohydrates. We don't see as much of an impact with a lot of those pulses when they're incorporated with other plant proteins as well and high fiber grains, because there is more protein and fiber. So we see some benefits there as well from a higher intake of fiber when we're following more plant-based proteins, because things like almonds and walnuts and black beans and lentils, they have protein, but they also have a ton of fiber that helps to reduce cholesterol and also keeps us full longer and is lower on that glycemic index we talked about. So we definitely see good outcomes, with respect to diabetes. I would argue it's potentially cheaper. Meat is still through the roof right now since COVID. So budget-wise, we can really stretch that dollar with more plant-based. I find for people, it's more of a lifestyle switch. We're very much still a meat, potatoes, veggie way of eating. And so it can be more of a switch that way. I find that's helpful for people to pick, say, one meal a day to start in terms of trying to transition to more plant proteins. So they may have a salad or a soup, and instead of putting meat on it, putting, again, even canned black beans or canned lentils in that pot of soup, or, a quarter of a cup even to start on their salad, or if they're having a wrap, mashing some chickpeas and using that as the protein instead of leftover chicken or ham or something along those lines. Necessary? No, but there's definitely benefits.
That's great. I was actually going to ask you if you could provide some suggestions for how people can incorporate more plant-based proteins in their diet. So good to get those ideas for people who maybe are not accustomed to eating a lot of plant-based proteins, but want to start. So we're about halfway through open hours now, everybody. The time is just flying by. Thanks again so much for joining us. We're here with Jenna Walsh, registered dietitian and certified diabetes educator. She's here to answer all of your nutrition-related questions. So use that chat feature to ask anything about diabetes and nutrition. You can certainly also share your story about how you're affected by diabetes, talk a little bit about how diabetes is impacting your life. And we'll just keep going. Jenna, you were talking before a little bit about different types of carbohydrates, and wondered if you could just provide a little information about simple versus complex carbs. So people may have heard those terms before, and there may be a little bit of confusion about what those are. So tell us about simple and complex carbs.
Yeah, so think of your simple carbohydrates basically as your sugars. They're one unit. It doesn't take your body much effort to break down. It's going to be things like your honey, your maple syrup, juice really is everything's been broken down and removed as well. They're very easy for the body to use right away. Now, most people, when I say that, say, okay, so they're bad. They're not bad. But if we're having them, we want to have them with, again, going back to that protein and the fiber to help, again, reduce that spike. Where they're beneficial is when people are having a low. So when blood sugars fall under that 4 or 3.8, we actually want to be reaching for those simple sugars. Tablespoon of honey, a half a cup of juice, a half a cup of regular pop, because that's what's actually going to take little time for your body to bring those sugars back up into a safe level. Now, on the flip side of that, your complex carbohydrates, I want you to think of a whole bunch of sugars tied together like a chain. They're complex. They've got some hydrogen and oxygen as well, and potentially different fiber molecules, some protein, all of those good things. Again, that really complex Lego block, right? Takes more effort for the body to break it down and to absorb it into the bloodstream. So from a meal in day-to-day intake, we want to focus on more complex carbohydrate and try to build most of our meals around those. On the flip side of that, if we're having a low, these are not the ones we want to grab. We don't want, a half a cup of lentils with whatever mixed in, veggies mixed in. It's going to take too long for the body to bring those sugars up. So complex, exactly as they sound, they're complicated for the body to break down. Simple, super easy, very quick for the blood sugar to spike.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, related to that concept, and also something you mentioned before, just wondering if you can expand a little bit on this whole concept of carb counting. What is it? Who needs to do it? How do you do it? Why is it important?
Yeah. I, with type 2 diabetes, I avoid getting too in depth with carb counting because I try not to have food become numbers for people. With insulin use, we do get into carb counting, not necessarily right away. We start with kind of that plate method again, but we're very much looking at a food label or measuring food. We have different lists for foods that let us know how many grams of carbohydrate per weight of food. So then we would be essentially weighing that food, using that calculation to figure out in what we're about to eat, how many grams of carbohydrates. That with insulin, we figure out a ratio of how many units of insulin we need at a meal per grams of carbohydrate. So that's pretty complex and detailed for today. There may be some people out there, any of our type 1s especially, or any of our type 2s on MDI, who maybe have already, been dabbling in that or experts in it. That is the simplest way to look at it. If we are, for example, looking at a food product and it says, there's 48 grams of carbohydrates, we also use an exchange system to simplify that, where roughly 15 grams of carbohydrate would be one carbohydrate. So for example, we have some great resources that sort of already list the carbohydrates in foods and what portion would equal one. And the simplest way is typically one piece of bread, 1 cup of milk, and 1 medium-sized fruit are all roughly equal to 15 grams or 1 serving. So there's a difference depending where a patient is at with their diabetes or what type and what medications or insulins they're using that determines whether we get into that in-depth discussion around carbohydrates, because it even goes beyond that, right? It also depends on the amount of fiber, subtract fiber from the total carbohydrate, the complexity of that meal. Again, we talked about it, how much protein's in there and fat. So
you can see why nutrition is such an interesting topic to people, because it's complex, and one question kind of leads into the next. So happy to have you here to help us figure this all out. Let's talk about carbs a little longer, and then maybe we'll shift away. And again, just encouraging people to bring up anything that they're wondering about related to diabetes nutrition in the chat, or you can come off mute to ask your question to Jenna. We welcome story sharing as well and reactions in the chat feature. You mentioned recently in one of your responses the glycemic index. So walk us through that. For people who don't know what the glycemic index is, tell us about how you use it and kind of what it's all about.
Yeah, so the easiest way to do it is there's been different studies and evaluations on different foods on how quickly they raise our blood sugar. So from there, then foods were categorized using basically a light system, so like green, yellow, red, into being low glycemic index, meaning they had minimal impact or less impact. Things like, really higher fiber, higher protein, really is the easiest way to simplify it. Grains and cereals, versus as they get more into the red, they're typically more refined with less protein and fiber, right? So like really dense 12-grain bread being low versus like a low fiber, low protein white bread. Now, since then though, I mean, if you look in the bread aisle, right, there's 200 varieties of bread. We also now have white bread that has added fiber and protein, and so it's different. So we can't just simplify it that way, but we use it as a really good starting point and education piece for patients. I don't know if I can share my screen, Anne, but I did have it open in case anybody asked me. Amazing, thank you, you shared it. Perfect. I figured that would come up. It comes up a lot. So it is one of those things I always say to people, you know what, use it as a guide, as a starting point. And then little things, right? Like I brought up before in terms of bananas for some people, because that's a big one. But even something like barley is low on the glycemic index. For some people, they might have barley and it might still impact their blood sugars fairly significantly. We can also take a high glycemic index food like instant white rice and add protein, canned tuna, chicken, lentils, and veggies, frozen, fresh, canned, whatever, fits your budget or makes you happy, and make that high glycemic index food a low glycemic index meal. So again, I never like people to feel stuck with foods or deterred based on their budget or their ability to cook certain foods. We can still eat really well on any of those budgets and also with any of the foods that we're used to eating. So again, use it as a guide, but keep in mind when we talk glycemic index and blood sugar spiking, we still have that ability to reduce the glycemic load of a meal by adding protein and fiber and fat.
I see a question in the chat here from Maria. Thanks, Maria. So Maria is wondering about incorporating glycemic variability into patient education. And Maria is wondering how you personally use this concept in your practice. That's a super question, Maria. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for some people, so I think what you're meaning is, some people will stay fairly low carbohydrate and then, occasionally have higher carbohydrate meals, and or choosing, right, from some of those lower glycemic index foods and higher, and trying to pair them. And so both are always fine, right? Like having variety and variability in foods is normal. It's natural. That's an intuitive way of eating for a lot of people. The most important piece I always say or encourage people is just check your blood sugars, right? So if most of the time you're eating fairly low glycemic index or low carbohydrate or whatever, and blood sugars are typically within target, and you do have something that's higher glycemic index, or you do go out for a higher carbohydrate meal, or you have one at home, it's fine. Just check and see where your blood sugars are at later. Because if we say suddenly out of nowhere have a lasagna or a spaghetti or pizza, and that's all we eat, we have some room that even if blood sugars are high later, again, we can reduce that glycemic load by adding some veggies to it the next time around, having more protein, right? So maybe having less pasta, have more sauce, have a salad on the side. So you can always have that variability and that variety. We always encourage that. I'm hoping most people who are doing education are encouraging that as well, because it's not realistic for us to assume living with diabetes, these are the only foods we're allowed to eat for the rest of our time here. We need to have variety.
Yeah, that's a really terrific question from Maria. And just want to direct everybody's attention to the chat where I put in the link to Diabetes Canada's resource about the glycemic index food guide. So you can access that. It's a PDF on the Diabetes Canada website. So wondering a little bit about sweeteners, Jenna, if you can talk to us a bit about sugars and sweeteners, so artificial sweeteners and then sort of natural sources of sugar. And starting with the whole idea of like, are all sugars created equal? So brown sugar, white sugar, honey, molasses, maple syrup, are those all the same or are some better than others?
Yeah, it's such a big topic. Sugar is sugar. So when we're talking in a diabetes world, all of the sugars, right? Whether it's agave syrup, which again is like this trendy sugar, lactose, honey, glucose, all of it, maple syrup, molasses, it's all gonna give us, those 4 grams of carbohydrates. So in a diabetes world, they're all the same. Some people will argue, natural maple syrup has more micronutrients. The amount of sugar that we would have to eat to get any valuable nutrition from them, blood sugars would be through the roof. So it's not a source of micronutrients when we look at it. And so the biggest thing is always, if you're having sugar or maple syrup or honey, eat the one that you enjoy. That's the most important piece. When we start to get into sweeteners, right? So everyone also has their own personal belief and view on sweeteners, that they're either okay or they're not good for us. From an evidence point of view, which is where we practice from, is we look at, what is the safety level that's been tested. It doesn't necessarily mean beyond there it's not safe. It means that's the level at which they've tested and there's been no adverse effects, right? So with each sweetener that's out there, so there's sugar alcohols, for example. Sugar alcohols are also naturally found in foods, right? So like sorbitol, mannitol, all of these are natural sugars, and same with xylitol in foods. There's no issue with them. They don't boost our blood sugar like regular sugar does. The difference being with sugar alcohols is if you're having too much, typically beyond 10 grams a day, you might have digestive side effects because they pull fluid into the gut. Okay. So any of those ones typically that end in OL are those sugar alcohols. Outside of that, there's a bunch of sugar-free substitutes available out there. The one I typically like to highlight to people where they potentially could be eating beyond that suggested safe limit is the cyclamate, which is like the sugar twin or the sweet and low. The ADI, which is that acceptable daily amount, is really around just under that 600 milligrams. And one of those packets would be close to 270 milligrams. So for people, if they're constantly eating sweet and low, that's the only one that, to kind of just be cautious with. Outside of that, things like sucralose, which is, your Splenda, again, great. You'd have to eat a lot of Splenda. I think it's close to 2 cups in a day to even come close to that ADI. Stevia, again, same thing. You can buy the actual stevia plants and plant them if you really like it. The levels are there. It would take a lot for people to get close to that ADI. And again, that tested level doesn't necessarily mean there's adverse effects beyond it. It's just more that that's the level they've been tested at. Again, the bigger thing to look at that I say to people, if they're baking and all of a sudden they're feeling like, okay, well, I'm going to have to buy a Splenda or stevia and start baking. If you're making cookies that have oats and flour and spending more money to add stevia or Splenda that you don't like, there's still carbohydrates in those cookies from the flour and the oats. So removing the sugar doesn't remove the carbohydrates. It absolutely can decrease it, but there's a balance between the satisfaction from food and how much you need to be satisfied and enjoy versus just feeling restricted by a lot of foods, right? So that's a balance. If you're having coffee and you're just as happy with stevia or Splenda or whatever in your coffee, amazing. That makes a big difference because some people will end up with a tablespoon or more. But in terms of baking and cooking, again, just be mindful in terms of there's still going to be carbohydrates likely in a lot of those foods. There's also a great resource, and sorry, and I can send that as well.
Yes, I just popped into the chat a link to the Diabetes Canada resource on sugars and sweeteners. Again, it's a PDF that people can access that has good general information about sugars that affect blood glucose and sugars and sweeteners that don't so much. So that's there for people to take a look at. So we've got about 10 minutes left in our time here. I can't believe how quickly this hour is going. Now's your chance, everybody, to put those questions into the chat. Come off mute if you'd like to share your story or to talk to us a little bit about how diabetes impacts your life and what you're wondering about nutrition. Maybe we can shift away a little bit from carbs and talk a bit about some other things that we find in our food. So alcohol and caffeine. So what is the deal with these for somebody living with diabetes? Do they have to avoid them? Are there special things that they should know about intake of alcohol and caffeine? What do you tell people?
Yeah, so caffeine in general, right? So caffeine is going to constrict blood vessels, and just the way that it affects the body is going to increase blood sugars. So we know that even if it's black, it doesn't mean don't drink it. Again, biggest thing is awareness, right? If you get up in the morning and you have a coffee and test your blood sugars 2 hours after, and it's 8 or 10 or whatever, and you haven't eaten anything, it's just be mindful that it's probably the coffee, which is okay. If you're hitting Tim's for a triple, there's a lot of added sugar in your coffee. So I find it's not so much just the caffeine, sometimes it's what we're adding to it, to be mindful that it can be impacting your blood sugar. With alcohol, the same is true in a few ways. It's a bit more complex, right? So alcohol in itself, if we're just having liquor with no added carbohydrates, is going to divert the liver from releasing sugar while it breaks down the alcohol. So we sometimes actually see blood sugars dip a little bit. Now it gets a bit more complicated depending how much we have and also what medications we're on. Because if we're on medications that can cause our blood sugars to go low, we run the risk of going low, right? I also find then if people are having things like beer or alcohol as well, like any of the coolers that do have carbohydrates or even wine, we get kind of just more erratic blood sugars where you might see a dip, but then you might see them spike one way or the other, because it also then depends on how we're eating and behaving while we're having those drinks. So typically, I mean, people with prediabetes and type 2, if they're not on insulin, it's not as much of a concern from a safety perspective. The other thing that alcohol does is it increases our triglycerides, or it can, which is a blood fat, which again, it's just more that we kind of see that increased double risk of heart disease with diabetes. There were just recently updated guidelines around the suggested alcohol limits. They're quite strict. I don't know if people have already seen them and sort of what their thoughts on them are, but it's really suggesting less than 2 drinks a week. And that's more from a heart health perspective, chronic disease perspective, and also cancer. So you don't have to cut it out. Again, it comes back to management, right? I mean, if you're going to have a few glasses of wine, have them, enjoy them, but check your blood sugars. That's all.
Yeah, I think those alcohol guidelines that you were talking about, Jenna, that were recently released are from the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, so people can check those out online. And you know, good to consider the impact of both alcohol and caffeine on blood sugars, so that people with diabetes are really aware when they're consuming different things, what effect it might have. Now, speaking of beverages, we hear from a lot of places, a lot of sources, that water is really important for our health. But some people just are not crazy about water. It can be maybe boring or bland. So even though we know we should probably drink a fair bit of water in the day, maybe we're less inclined. So what tips or tricks do you have for people to increase their intake of water?
Yeah, first starting point I always suggest is whatever else you're having, add ice cubes. It's an easy starting point. Tons and tons of ice. Every time you're having something else, add ice. Outside of that there's a little bit of mind over matter too sometimes, right? Like sometimes I find it's habit. If we're always grabbing for something sweet, it's because we've also trained our brain that this is what I enjoy. Water tastes gross, I hear sometimes, because we're actually expecting the sweetness. There's some gradual transition that we see when people actually start increasing their water. So we can actually just start there versus also adding frozen fruit. You can buy frozen sliced lemons and limes, which are super convenient to add into even a full jug of water and leave it in the fridge. Some people really just like cold water. So actually getting a really nice decanter or something that fits in your fridge to leave it in there so it's nice and cold. The other thing that I ask is, depending on your water, you might not like the taste of it. So some water is really high in iron or other minerals. It might be worth investing in like a Culligan system, right? Just even the ones where you can get the filled up jugs. So those are options. You can also get now like the carbonated, like the PC waters or the bubblies. They're sugar-free. They're really just flavored carbonated waters. Those are nice sometimes. They're also a really nice alternative if you're looking for that drink in the afternoon or in the evening. There's something that's just a little bit different, right? Yeah, I'm a big fan of adding the frozen fruit, sometimes even veggies, like adding mint and cucumber is lovely. And you can sometimes even just save the tips of your cucumber and throw them in a Tupperware or baggie in the freezer, and then throw them in your jug of water. So that's super easy to do as well. Outside of that, I sometimes too, if people are drinking coffee all day, is even just start with, before you fill up another cup, fill your mug with water and just down it. An easy way to start.
Yeah, those are really good tips. Just have a couple minutes left here, and welcoming any last questions, comments, stories, anything in the chat, or you can come off mute to share. Jenna, you've talked a couple times about cost, and we know right now that we're dealing with rising food costs, and that healthy eating can be quite expensive, and sometimes people feel like prohibitively so. So what are some tips that you have? Really, I mean, for anybody, but specifically for people who are living with diabetes, about eating well on a budget?
Yeah. First thing, and I think most people who are on a budget know this, is don't buy into the name brand. The no name, the store brand are typically as nutritious for a fraction of the cost. I'm a huge fan of frozen veggies and fruit. They're as nutritious, they're picked up prime, flash frozen for the most part, and they last longer. They're not going to spoil on us. And now the lovely thing is, you can buy frozen spinach and frozen kale and frozen edamame beans and, pretty much every veggie, frozen butternut squash, all of those things that give you a ton of variety. They give you a lot of options for your meals, and they're less expensive. I definitely don't recommend, buying things out of season. Like strawberries and berries this time of year are astronomical. There is some value sometimes also in the points programs. So different grocery stores, like Independent, for example, will do the PC points. You can surprisingly actually build up quite a bit of money to then get free groceries, right? So people, if you think of kind of some of those like coupon clipping behaviors, if you're mindful of what foods points are available for, and you're buying more of those things in bulk those weeks, especially if they're frozen or canned items, you can build up a lot of return income for that. Outside of that, canned and bagged beans. So again, going back to the vegetarian, it's like $1.25 to buy a bag of dried beans. There's tons of YouTube videos on how to cook them, what to add them to. You can add them to anything. They're fantastic for protein and fiber, balanced nutritionally, right? When we really get down to it in terms of those two nutrients alone. And so then adding even just whether it's rice or whether it's some frozen veggies, and you have a nutritionally balanced meal for really under $1.50 or $2, compared to if we're trying to buy fresh veggies and meat and whatever else. So it makes a big difference.
That's a great practical note to leave things on. Jenna, I just want to thank you so much for being with us today on Diabetes Open Hours. It was a pleasure, and I learned a lot from you. I hope that our viewers did as well. And just as a final message to everybody, we want to thank you, the participants, for joining us today and for being part of this very first Diabetes Open Hours. There will be an evaluation coming to you, so please let us know what you thought about this format. And we are looking for ways to really tailor this to suit you, the participants. So please share your feedback with us. To learn more and to stay up to date on Diabetes Canada work and resources, you can also visit our website, diabetes.ca, or check out our social media channels. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. You can also call our information team at 1-800-BANTING, so BANTING, or email us at info@diabetes.ca with questions. Join us in April for our next Diabetes Open Hours, and please stay tuned to our social channels and to the Diabetes Canada webinar page. If you Google Diabetes Canada upcoming webinars, you'll find that page, and there will be information there posted shortly about our next open hours, what the date will be, and the topic, as well as the registration information. We hope you found this webinar helpful for you, and we look forward to hearing your feedback and to seeing you back again soon. Thanks so much.